The sun dipped low over the small town of Willow Creek, casting golden streaks across the sky. It was one of those evenings where everything seemed just right. The air crisp, the distant hum of cicadas, and the occasional bark of a dog echoing through the quiet streets. But for Sarah Thompson, a local veterinarian, the peaceful evening would soon take an unexpected turn. Sarah had just closed up the Willow Creek Animal Clinic, stretching her tired arms after a long day of checkups and surgeries. Her assistant, Mike, was already locking the side door when the sound of frantic barking cut through the air. Sarah turned to see a young boy sprinting towards them, his eyes wide with panic. "Dr. Thompson, please, you have to help!" the boy gasped, clutching at the stitch in his side. "Slow down, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, kneeling to his level. "What's wrong?" "It's Daisy. She's really sick. She just collapsed." Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Mike before standing. "Where is she?" "Down by the old Miller barn," the boy said. "Please, hurry!" Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her emergency bag from the clinic and jumped into her truck. Mike helped the boy, whose name she recognized as Ethan from the Miller family, into the passenger seat before they sped off toward the barn at the edge of town. The drive wasn't long, but every second felt like an eternity as Ethan wrung his hands, his breath coming in short, worried bursts. "She's pregnant," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think something's really wrong." Sarah's grip tightened on the wheel. She had seen plenty of difficult pregnancies in dogs, but Ethan's fear made her stomach twist. When they reached the barn, the sight before her made her heart lurch. Daisy, a beautiful golden retriever, lay on her side in the dirt, her chest rising and falling in shallow pants. Her golden fur was matted, and her eyes were glassy. Sarah rushed to her, her hands immediately moving to check her vitals. Daisy's heartbeat was weak, her body trembling as she let out a soft whimper. "She's in distress," Sarah murmured, carefully pressing along Daisy's belly. The dog let out a sharp yelp, her body tensing under Sarah's hands. "Is she going to be okay?" Ethan's voice wavered. "We need to get her back to the clinic right away." Sarah's tone was firm but calm. "Mike, help me lift her." Mike nodded, crouching down to gently scoop Daisy into his arms. The retriever whimpered, but didn't resist, too weak to protest. Ethan scrambled into the back seat as Sarah and Mike carefully settled Daisy onto a blanket. They sped back toward the clinic, the atmosphere thick with worry. Ethan kept whispering reassurances to Daisy, his small hand resting lightly on her fur. Once at the clinic, Sarah moved with practiced urgency. "Get the ultrasound ready," she called to Mike as she prepped Daisy for examination. Ethan sat in the corner, his knees drawn to his chest, watching in silence. His face was pale, his lip trembling as he fought back tears. Sarah ran the ultrasound probe over Daisy's swollen belly, her brows knitting together. Something wasn't right. The screen flickered to life, and Sarah's breath hitched. Her mind raced to process what she was seeing. "What is it?" Mike asked, his eyes darting between Sarah and the screen. Sarah's hands trembled slightly. This can't be right." Ethan jumped to his feet. "What? What's wrong with Daisy?" Sarah turned to the boy, her voice gentle but laced with shock. "Ethan, I think Daisy's carrying more than just puppies." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "There's something unusual in her belly." Sarah took a deep breath. "We need to operate immediately." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "Will she be okay?" "I'll do everything I can, I promise." Mike helped prep Daisy for surgery while Sarah sterilized her hands. As they worked, Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. What was inside Daisy? A deformity? A tumor? A misplaced organ? She had seen strange cases before, but nothing quite like this. The clinic's lights buzzed softly as Sarah made the first incision. Ethan sat just outside the operating room, clutching his hands together in silent prayer. The minutes felt like hours as Sarah carefully worked, her fingers steady despite the anxious pounding of her heart. Then she saw it. Her breath caught in her throat. "Mike, look at this." Mike leaned over, his face draining of color. "That's not possible." Sarah's hands moved delicately as she freed the unexpected discovery from Daisy's womb. The room fell into stunned silence. Outside, Ethan sat frozen, waiting for news, his heart pounding. He had no idea that the next words he heard would change everything. To be continued. Ethan's fingers dug into his knees as he sat on the cold bench outside the operating room. He had never prayed this hard in his life, whispering the same words over and over. "Please let Daisy be okay. Please let Daisy be okay." The silence inside the clinic was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the monitor and the occasional clatter of surgical instruments. He couldn't see what was happening beyond the frosted glass doors, but he could feel the weight of it. Inside the room, Sarah's hands trembled slightly, though she steadied them quickly. She had been a veterinarian for over 10 years, but nothing had prepared her for what she was seeing. Mike's voice was barely above a whisper. "What in the world?" Sarah swallowed hard and forced herself to focus. "We need to be careful. Whatever this is, Daisy is still fighting." She glanced at the monitor. Her heart rate was low, but stable. She had to move fast. With delicate precision, Sarah removed the first puppy. It was smaller than normal, its fur slick and damp, but it was breathing. She handed it off to Mike, who immediately began clearing its airway. The second puppy followed, then a third. Each one was alive, though unusually small. But then, as she reached deeper, she felt something strange. "Mike," she said carefully, "this isn't normal. There's something else here." Mike peered over her shoulder, his breath hitching. "What is that?" It wasn't a puppy. It wasn't anything she had ever seen inside a dog before. At first, she thought it might be some kind of mass, but when she lifted it free, she realized it was something entirely different. It was wrapped in a thick membrane, unlike anything she had encountered in all her years of practice. She carefully set it on the sterile tray, heart pounding. "What is that?" Mike repeated, his voice more urgent now. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know." Ethan sat up straighter as the door finally swung open. Sarah stepped out, her surgical gloves still on, her expression unreadable. "She made it through surgery," she said quickly, before he could panic. "She's resting now." Ethan let out a shaky breath of relief, but Sarah's face told him there was more. "And the puppies?" Sarah hesitated. "3 of them. They're small, but they're breathing." Ethan's eyes brightened. "Can I see them?" "Soon. But Ethan, there was something else." She knelt in front of him. "I need to show you something, and I don't want you to be scared." Ethan's brows furrowed, his excitement dimming. "What do you mean?" "Come with me." Ethan followed her back inside. Daisy lay on a soft bed, her breathing even, though exhaustion weighed heavily on her. 3 tiny golden puppies were curled against her belly, nursing weakly. But Sarah led him past them, toward the metal tray where a strange bundle sat under a warm lamp. "What is that?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "We don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "It was inside Daisy, along with the puppies." Ethan stared at the membrane-covered shape, his pulse quickening. It was moving. Mike stiffened. "Sarah, it's moving." Sarah grabbed a pair of forceps, carefully pulling back the outer layer. What lay beneath made her breath catch. It was smaller than the puppies, but its body was fully formed. And unlike the others, its fur was almost pure white. Its tiny chest rose and fell in shallow but steady breaths. "It's alive," Ethan murmured, eyes wide. Sarah nodded. "But it's different." She examined the tiny creature, noting the unusual shape of its ears, the faint blue tint in its eyes even before they had fully opened. Something about it sent a chill through her, but not in a bad way. Just in a way that told her this was no ordinary puppy. Ethan reached out a hesitant hand. Can I touch it?" Sarah hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Gently." Ethan's fingers brushed against its fur, and the tiny thing gave a weak, almost mewling sound. His heart squeezed. "It's so small. Will it survive?" "We're going to do everything we can," Sarah assured him. "But Ethan, I need to ask you something important." He looked up at her. "Has Daisy been anywhere unusual lately? Anywhere she could have met another dog that wasn't from around here?" Ethan frowned. "No. I mean, she runs around the farm, but she's never gone too far. She mostly just stays near the house." Sarah exchanged a look with Mike. This was strange. Dogs didn't just have something like this inside them. The clinic was quiet, except for the soft breathing of the resting animals. The white pup stirred again, its tiny mouth opening in a silent yawn. Ethan's heart swelled. "Does he have a chance?" Sarah smiled, though it was laced with worry. "We're going to do everything we can, but we need to keep a close eye on him. He's fragile." Ethan nodded, determination setting in. "I want to help." "Then let's start by making sure he's warm and fed." For the next several hours, they took turns monitoring Daisy and her pups. The 3 golden puppies were doing well, nursing as they should. But the white one was different. It struggled to latch onto Daisy, and when it did, it seemed to tire quickly. Ethan stayed by its side, his hands cupped around its tiny body for warmth. "He needs a name," Ethan said suddenly. "Something special." Sarah considered this. "Something strong." Ethan looked down at the fragile creature, his mind spinning. Finally, he whispered, "Lucky." Mike grinned. "That's a good name." Sarah nodded. "Then Lucky it is." Ethan smiled, stroking the pup's tiny head. "You're going to make it, Lucky. I promise." But deep inside, Sarah still felt a gnawing worry. Lucky wasn't like the others, and she had a feeling that whatever had brought him into the world was only the beginning. Ethan barely left the clinic for the next few days. His parents had come by to check on him, and while they were relieved that Daisy had survived, they were also a little puzzled by Ethan's unwavering focus on Lucky. The 3 golden puppies were doing well, growing stronger by the hour, but Lucky was different. He was smaller, weaker, and needed constant care. Sarah had set up a special incubator for Lucky, adjusting the temperature to keep him warm. Every few hours, she or Ethan fed him with a tiny bottle, making sure he got enough nourishment. At first, he struggled to latch, his tiny body trembling with effort, but slowly, he began to take in more. "He's a fighter," Ethan murmured one night, his chin resting on the edge of the incubator as he watched Lucky's tiny chest rise and fall. "I can tell." Sarah smiled as she sat down next to him. "He is, but he still has a long way to go." Ethan nodded. He wasn't giving up on Lucky. He refused to. On the fourth day, something unexpected happened. Lucky had been asleep for most of the afternoon, curled up in the incubator, his little body barely moving except for his slow breathing. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the clinic, Lucky stirred. Ethan sat up straighter. "Sarah, look!" Sarah turned from where she was organizing medical supplies. Lucky's tiny body stretched, his little paws pressing against the soft blanket. Then, for the first time, his eyes opened. Ethan gasped. "His eyes." Sarah stepped closer, her brows furrowing. She had expected them to be blue at first, as most newborn puppies' eyes were. But Lucky's weren't just blue. They were almost glowing, a soft, silvery hue that shimmered in the dim light. Mike, who had just walked into the room, stopped in his tracks. "Whoa, is that normal?" Sarah swallowed. "No, it's not." Ethan leaned closer. "Does that mean something's wrong with him?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "Not necessarily. Some dogs have lighter-colored eyes, but I've never seen anything quite like this before." Ethan reached out a careful finger and brushed Lucky's head. The tiny pup let out a soft sound, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh, then nuzzled into Ethan's touch. "He's okay," Ethan whispered. "He's just different." Sarah nodded, though the uneasy feeling in her chest remained. Different. That was the only way to describe it. The following days brought more surprises. Lucky wasn't just surviving. He was growing stronger. Faster than Sarah had expected. His fur, once damp and fragile, was now fluffier, pure white, and impossibly soft. His coordination improved quickly. By the end of the week, while the golden puppies were still wobbling as they tried to walk, Lucky was already standing steadily on his tiny legs. Mike whistled. "That's one determined pup." Sarah watched as Lucky padded across the blanket where the other puppies lay sleeping. His movements were sure, almost too sure for a puppy his age. And then there were his eyes. They had only grown more striking. Even in the dim lighting, they reflected the room around him, catching details in a way Sarah had never seen before. Ethan was thrilled. "See? I told you he was special." Sarah couldn't argue with that, but she still felt like there was more to Lucky than met the eye. One afternoon, while Daisy rested and the other puppies dozed, Lucky did something else unexpected. Ethan had been playing with a soft toy, gently dragging it across the blanket for Lucky to follow. At first, it was simple. Lucky would stumble forward, his little tail wagging as he tried to chase it. But then, suddenly, the toy slipped from Ethan's fingers and rolled under a low shelf. "Oops, hold on, Lucky, I'll get it," Ethan said, getting to his feet. But before he could move, Lucky did something strange. He paused, ears twitching, his silvery eyes locking onto the toy's location even though it was completely hidden. Then, without hesitation, he darted forward and squeezed into the small gap beneath the shelf. Mike raised an eyebrow. "That's quick." Sarah crouched down to see better. Lucky wasn't just sniffing for the toy. He knew exactly where it was. His tiny paws worked carefully as he nudged it out, then proudly trotted back to Ethan, dropping the toy at his feet. Ethan laughed. "Did you see that? He knew where it was." Sarah exchanged a glance with Mike. That wasn't normal puppy behavior. At this age, their vision was still developing. They relied mostly on scent and touch. But Lucky had moved with purpose, like he could see straight through the shelf. Mike shook his head, grinning. Maybe he's just gifted, like a dog genius. Ethan beamed. I knew he was special. Sarah chuckled, though a small part of her still wondered. That night, when the clinic was quiet, she stayed behind after Ethan had gone home. She sat in the dim light, watching Lucky sleep beside his siblings. The golden puppies were nestled together, their soft snores filling the air. But Lucky was different. He slept apart, curled up but alert even in his rest. Sarah sighed, rubbing a hand over her forehead. What are you, little one? The next morning, another surprise arrived in the form of Daisy. She had been recovering well, her energy returning as she cared for her puppies. But when Ethan arrived at the clinic, something was different about her. Sarah, come quick! Sarah rushed in from the back office. What's wrong? Ethan pointed. Look at Daisy. Daisy was standing near her puppies, but her attention was fixed on Lucky. Her eyes were wide, ears perked forward in an intense focus. She wasn't scared, but she was watching him differently than she watched her other pups. Sarah crouched beside her. Daisy? What is it, girl? Daisy's gaze didn't waver. Then, as if making up her mind, she stepped forward and nudged Lucky gently with her nose. Not in the way she did with the others. This was different, protective, almost reverent. Ethan's voice was quiet. She knows. Sarah looked at him. Knows what? Ethan swallowed, then reached out and picked Lucky up carefully. The tiny pup blinked at him with those shimmering eyes, tilting his head. That he's not just any dog. He's meant for something more. Ethan cradled Lucky in his hands, his breath catching as he looked into the pup's unusual eyes. Something about them felt almost human, deep, knowing. Lucky wasn't just looking at him. It felt like he was looking into him. Daisy still stood frozen, watching her smallest pup with an intensity that Ethan had never seen before. Sarah gently placed a hand on Daisy's back, her voice soft. It's okay, girl. He's your puppy. Daisy blinked slowly, then took another cautious step forward. She nudged Lucky again, this time licking his tiny head. It was the first real display of affection she had shown him, and Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. She accepts him, he murmured. Mike, who had been leaning against the counter, finally spoke. Not just that. It's like she's recognizing him, like she's finally realizing who he is. Sarah frowned. That doesn't make any sense. She's his mother. She should have recognized him from the start. Ethan stroked Lucky's soft fur. Maybe she needed time. Maybe he needed time. For the next few days, Daisy's behavior continued to shift. While she cared for all her puppies, she paid special attention to Lucky. If he wandered too far, she would get up and bring him back, gently picking him up in her mouth just as she did with the others. But it wasn't just protectiveness. There was something deeper, an unspoken understanding between mother and pup that none of them could explain. Lucky, meanwhile, continued to grow at an unusual rate. His fur had thickened faster than normal, his small legs growing stronger by the day. By the end of the second week, he was walking with far more confidence than his siblings, who still wobbled on unsteady paws. Sarah observed him closely. This isn't normal. Puppies his age should still be clumsy. Their coordination shouldn't be this sharp yet. Mike nodded. But it's not just how he moves. It's how he reacts. He notices things before the others do. It's like his senses are sharper. Ethan grinned. Maybe he's just special. Sarah smiled at Ethan's unwavering belief in Lucky. I don't doubt that. But I still want to run a few tests, nothing invasive, she added quickly at Ethan's concerned look. Just basic ones, reflexes, vision, hearing, just to understand him better. Ethan hesitated before nodding. As long as it doesn't hurt him. The next day, Sarah set up a few simple tests. She started with a vision assessment, using a small flashlight to check how Lucky's pupils reacted to light. She expected a normal response, but what she saw made her pause. His pupils are adjusting faster than normal, she murmured, adjusting the light. Much faster. Mike frowned. What does that mean? Sarah shook her head. I don't know. It's like his eyes are adapting instantly, no hesitation. Puppies don't usually have this level of visual sharpness at this age. Ethan smiled proudly. He's just advanced. Sarah chuckled. That's one way to put it. Next was hearing. She placed Lucky in the middle of the exam table and had Ethan and Mike stand at opposite sides of the room. She asked them to make small noises, snaps, taps, whispers, to see how Lucky would react. Within seconds, Lucky turned his head toward each sound almost instantly. There was no hesitation, no delay. He was processing sound faster than any puppy she had ever seen. Mike let out a low whistle. Okay, that's impressive. Sarah nodded. It's more than impressive. It's unusual. Ethan knelt beside the table, rubbing Lucky's ears. You're amazing, buddy. Lucky wagged his tiny tail, pressing his nose into Ethan's palm. It was then that something else happened. Something that made the air in the room go still. The door to the clinic was slightly ajar, and just beyond it, Sarah's office sat in darkness. There was no sound, no movement, nothing to suggest anything was there. But Lucky suddenly stiffened. His ears perked up, his body tensed. And then, without warning, he let out a tiny growl. It was barely more than a whisper of sound, but it sent a chill through Sarah's spine. Mike frowned. What's wrong with him? Ethan looked in the same direction as Lucky, but saw nothing. I don't know. Sarah moved toward the office and flipped on the light. The room was empty. Everything was exactly as she had left it. There was no reason for Lucky to react that way. No reason at all. But he had sensed something. She turned back to him. His silvery eyes were still locked on the doorway, his body still tense. Then, as if deciding whatever it was had passed, he relaxed, his tiny tail wagging again. Mike exhaled. Okay, that was weird. Ethan picked Lucky up. Maybe he just got spooked. Sarah wasn't so sure. Or maybe he saw something we didn't. Ethan held Lucky close. Whatever it was, he's okay now. Right, Lucky? The tiny pup yawned, snuggling into Ethan's arms as if nothing had happened. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Lucky had sensed something beyond their understanding. Days passed, and Lucky continued to grow stronger. The golden puppies were catching up, but Lucky was always a step ahead. He ran faster, reacted quicker, and seemed to understand things in a way that defied explanation. Daisy remained watchful, always close to him, as if she too knew he was different. One afternoon, Ethan sat outside the clinic, Lucky curled in his lap. The sun cast a warm glow over the yard, and for the first time in weeks, everything felt peaceful. Then, out of nowhere, Lucky lifted his head. His ears twitched, his body stiffened, and his eyes locked onto the far end of the road. Ethan followed his gaze, but saw nothing. "What is it, buddy?" Lucky didn't move. He stayed perfectly still, his attention focused on something Ethan couldn't see. Then, after a long moment, he let out a soft, low whimper. A shiver ran through Ethan. Sarah, who had been checking on the other puppies, looked up. "What's wrong?" Ethan pointed. "Lucky sees something." Sarah walked over, following Lucky's gaze. The road stretched ahead. Empty. There was nothing there. But then, just as she was about to turn back, a gust of wind rushed through the trees, rustling the leaves with an eerie whisper. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. Lucky let out another small whimper and buried his face into Ethan's chest. Sarah swallowed hard. "I think Lucky knows something we don't." Ethan held Lucky close, feeling the pup's tiny body tremble against his chest. The wind had settled, and the road ahead was still empty, but something in the air felt different. The silence stretched between them, heavy and waiting. Sarah knelt beside them, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Maybe he just got spooked," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. Sarah hesitated. "Or maybe he sensed something we can't." Mike leaned against the clinic door. "Okay, I know we've been saying Lucky's special, but this is starting to get weird. Puppies don't just react to nothing." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know, and that's what's bothering me." Ethan looked down at Lucky. His shimmering silver eyes blinked up at him, full of something Ethan couldn't quite name. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. "Whatever it was, it's gone now." Lucky gave a small sigh, relaxing into Ethan's arms, but the unease didn't fade. Sarah exchanged another glance with Mike before finally standing. "Come on, let's head inside." Ethan carried Lucky back into the clinic, but even as they stepped through the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been out there, just beyond their sight. The next few days passed in an odd haze. Lucky continued to grow stronger, but there was no denying that he was different. His senses were sharper, his instincts more refined. He seemed to anticipate things before they happened, responding to sounds before anyone else heard them, noticing movement before others did. One evening, Ethan stayed late at the clinic while Sarah finished paperwork. Lucky lay curled up beside him, his tiny body rising and falling in steady breaths. The other puppies were already asleep, huddled together in a soft pile of fur. Daisy watched them all from her usual spot, but her eyes flicked to Lucky every few minutes, as if checking on him specifically. Ethan absent-mindedly stroked Lucky's fur. "You really are special, huh?" Lucky's ears twitched, but he didn't wake. Ethan glanced toward the front window, watching the shadows stretch across the street. It was quiet, the town already settled in for the night. Then Lucky stirred, his body tensed, ears perking up. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Lucky lifted his head, staring at the door. A second later, Daisy did the same. Her posture shifted, her body stiffening as a low growl rumbled in her throat. Ethan's stomach tightened. Sarah looked up from her desk. "What's wrong?" Ethan pointed. "Daisy's growling. Lucky's acting weird, too." Sarah immediately stood, following their gaze to the door. The outside light flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the pavement. Mike had left earlier, so the clinic was locked for the night, but something about the way Daisy was reacting made Sarah's pulse quicken. She took a careful step forward. "Stay here with Lucky." Ethan's grip on the pup tightened. "Sarah, it's fine," she assured him, though her voice was quieter now. She reached for the light switch, flipping on the brighter overheads. The glow spread across the clinic, chasing away the dim shadows, but Daisy's growl didn't stop. If anything, it deepened. Sarah took a deep breath, then unlocked the door and eased it open just a crack. The street was empty. The wind rustled through the trees, the same eerie whispering sound from before. Nothing looked out of place, but the weight in the air remained. Sarah frowned. "Hello?" Silence. She exhaled, shaking her head. "There's nothing here." Daisy's growl softened, but didn't stop entirely. Lucky stayed pressed against Ethan, his tiny body still tense. Sarah sighed and locked the door again, turning back to them. Maybe she just heard something. Ethan didn't look convinced. Then why was Lucky acting weird too? Sarah didn't have an answer. That night, Ethan had trouble sleeping. He kept replaying the moment over and over, Lucky stiffening, Daisy growling, the way Sarah had hesitated before opening the door. It wasn't just random behavior. They had sensed something none of them could see. When morning came, he rushed back to the clinic. Lucky greeted him with excited little yips, his tiny tail wagging, but there was still something in his silvery eyes that made Ethan pause. Sarah was already in the back, checking on the other puppies. "You're here early." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I just wanted to check on Lucky. And Daisy." Sarah studied him for a moment before nodding. "They're fine, but I'll admit, last night was strange." Ethan knelt beside Lucky, scratching behind his ears. Do you think Lucky knows something we don't?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know, but I think we need to start paying more attention to him." Ethan nodded. "I think so too." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the unease never fully faded. That evening, as the clinic was closing, something new happened. Lucky was playing with one of his siblings, gently batting at the other puppy with his tiny paws. Ethan laughed as he watched them tumble over each other. But then Lucky suddenly froze. Ethan's smile faded. "Lucky?" The pup's head snapped up, his ears twitching. Then, without warning, he darted to the front of the clinic, his small paws skidding across the floor. He stopped right at the door, staring at it with an intensity Ethan had never seen before. Daisy immediately followed, standing beside him. This time, she didn't growl. She just stood, her body still, waiting. Sarah and Mike, who had just finished cleaning up for the night, turned toward them. Mike frowned. "What's going on now?" Ethan's heart pounded. "I don't know, but Lucky does." Sarah stepped forward cautiously, her gaze flicking between the two dogs. Then she turned toward the door. And this time, before she could even touch the handle, a knock echoed through the clinic. Ethan jumped. Mike swore under his breath. Sarah froze, her hand hovering just above the lock. The knock wasn't loud. It was slow, deliberate. She swallowed hard. "Who's there?" Silence. Daisy's body tensed. Lucky didn't move, his eyes never leaving the door. Sarah glanced at Ethan, then Mike, before finally gripping the handle. She took a breath, steeling herself, and pulled the door open. The porch light flickered slightly, casting a glow over the empty street. No one was there. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped onto the porch, scanning the street. The town was quiet, bathed in the dim glow of street lights. A few houses down, a porch light flickered, but there was no movement. No footsteps fading into the distance. No sign that anyone had been there at all. Ethan stayed just inside the clinic, clutching Lucky tightly. The pup was still staring at the open doorway, his silver eyes locked on something none of them could see. Mike leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "Okay, I'm officially creeped out." Sarah exhaled slowly and shut the door, locking it behind her. "There's no one there." Ethan's voice was quiet, but someone knocked. Sarah didn't have an answer. She knelt beside Lucky, brushing her fingers through his soft fur. He was still tense, his little body coiled as if waiting for something. Daisy stood beside him, her gaze flicking between the door and her pup, as if she was sensing the same thing. Mike let out a nervous chuckle. "So what? We have a ghost visitor now?" Sarah shot him a look, but the truth was she had no explanation. And she didn't like that. She had spent her entire career relying on science, logic, and experience. But now, for the first time, she was faced with something she couldn't explain. Ethan sat down with Lucky in his lap, his fingers absently stroking the pup's fur. "I think Lucky knows more than we do." Sarah sighed. "I don't doubt that. But what exactly is he sensing?" Mike raised an eyebrow. "And why is it connected to your clinic?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Ethan swallowed. "Do you think it has something to do with Daisy's pregnancy? With how Lucky was born?" Sarah's stomach twisted. That thought had crossed her mind more than once, but she had no way to prove it. "I don't know. But I think we need to start paying more attention to every little thing Lucky does." The night passed without any more disturbances, but none of them slept easily. The next morning, Ethan arrived early, rubbing his tired eyes as he stepped into the clinic. He had barely gotten any sleep, thoughts of Lucky and the mysterious knock keeping him awake. Sarah was already inside, sipping a cup of coffee. "You look like you got as much sleep as I did." Ethan forced a smile. "Yeah, couldn't stop thinking about last night." Sarah nodded. "Me neither, and I did some reading." Ethan's brows lifted. "Reading? About what?" Sarah set her cup down. "Canine instincts." Mike walked in just as she said it. "Okay, great. We're researching psychic dogs now." Sarah shot him a look. "I wouldn't go that far, but there are documented cases of dogs sensing things humans can't. Earthquakes before they happen, illnesses in their owners, even detecting danger." Ethan's grip on Lucky tightened. "So you think Lucky's sensing danger?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know, but it would explain why he reacts the way he does." Mike sat down. "Okay, let's say Lucky is picking up on something. How do we figure out what it is? We can't just sit around waiting for something else weird to happen." Ethan looked down at Lucky, the pup's silvery eyes reflecting the light. "Maybe he can show us." Sarah frowned. "How?" Ethan took a deep breath. "We follow him. See where he takes us." Mike scoffed. "You want to let a puppy lead us on a ghost hunt?" Ethan's expression was serious. "I just think we should trust him. If he's sensing something, maybe he can show us what it is." Sarah considered it. It wasn't exactly scientific, but at this point, science wasn't offering her any real answers. Finally, she nodded. "All right, let's see where Lucky takes us." They put a small harness on Lucky, and Ethan clipped on a leash. "Okay, buddy, show us." Lucky didn't hesitate. He pulled forward, his little legs moving with surprising determination. Daisy followed closely, her body tense, but her eyes steady. They stepped out of the clinic and into the crisp morning air. Lucky paused at the sidewalk, his ears twitching, then took a sharp turn toward the road. Ethan followed, his heart pounding. "Where are we going?" Lucky didn't stop. He led them past the familiar streets of town, past the bakery and the post office. People waved as they passed, but Ethan barely noticed. He was focused on Lucky, on the way the pup moved with certainty. Finally, Lucky stopped. Ethan nearly tripped over him. "What is it?" They were standing in front of an old house, just a few blocks from the clinic. The paint was peeling, the windows were boarded up. It had been empty for years. Mike frowned. "Why here?" Lucky let out a small whimper and took a step closer. Daisy stood beside him, her ears twitching. Ethan looked up at Sarah. "Do you know who used to live here?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yeah, it was a man named Walter Grayson. He was old, lived alone, passed away a few years ago." Mike crossed his arms. "And now Lucky's leading us here?" Sarah swallowed. "Looks like it." Ethan knelt beside Lucky. "Why here, buddy?" The pup's ears twitched again. He sniffed the air, then pressed his tiny paws against the old wooden door. Sarah exhaled. "I don't like this." Ethan bit his lip. "Maybe we should go inside." Mike groaned. "Oh, great. We're breaking into an abandoned house now." Sarah shook her head. "We're not breaking in. But I can call the property manager, see if they'll let us look." Ethan nodded. "Please. I have a feeling Lucky's trying to tell us something." Sarah pulled out her phone, stepping away to make the call. Lucky didn't move from the door, his little tail still, his body tense. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "What are you trying to show us, Lucky?" A breeze rushed past, sending a shiver down his spine. Sarah returned a moment later, her face unreadable. "They're sending someone over with a key." Mike groaned. "This just keeps getting better." Ethan ignored him, his eyes on Lucky. "We'll find out soon enough." Minutes later, a man in a dark jacket arrived, jingling a set of keys. "Not sure what you folks are looking for, but the house is just an old place. Been empty since Walter passed." Sarah nodded. "We just need to check something." The man unlocked the door and pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of wood and age settling over them. Lucky took a step forward. Daisy hesitated, then followed. Ethan swallowed hard. "Let's go." The floor creaked beneath their feet as they stepped inside. The house was dim, the only light filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows. Furniture sat untouched, covered in white sheets. An old clock on the wall had stopped at some forgotten hour. Mike coughed. "Okay, now what?" Lucky moved. He trotted across the floor, past the living room, down a narrow hallway. He stopped in front of a closed door and let out a small, insistent bark. Ethan reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold. Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the cold doorknob. The air in the abandoned house felt different now, heavier. Behind him, Sarah and Mike waited in tense silence. Lucky stood at his feet, his small body rigid, silver eyes locked on the door. Daisy was beside him, her ears twitching as if she too could sense something waiting beyond it. "Are we really doing this?" Mike muttered. "Because I'm not gonna lie, this feels like the part in the horror movie where we should turn around and leave." Ethan tightened his grip on Lucky's leash. "I trust him. He led us here for a reason." Sarah exhaled sharply, then gave a single nod. "All right, let's see what's inside." Ethan turned the knob. It was stiff, resisting at first, but with a little force, the latch gave, and the door creaked open. A musty scent spilled into the hallway, thick with dust, and something older, something untouched for years. The room was dark, but the faintest sliver of light slipped through the boarded-up window, casting eerie shadows over the floor. Ethan stepped inside first, his heart hammering. The room was small, maybe a study or a storage space. The air was colder here, making the hair on his arms stand up. His gaze swept over the forgotten furniture. An old wooden desk pushed against the wall, a tall bookshelf, and a worn-out armchair covered in a dust-streaked sheet. Lucky took a cautious step forward, his tiny nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Then he stopped abruptly, ears pricked, his entire body stiff. Daisy let out a low, uncertain whimper. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, kneeling beside Lucky. Sarah stepped inside next, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She scanned the room, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "There's something in here." Mike scoffed. "Yeah, a lot of dust." Sarah ignored him and moved toward the desk. She ran a finger across its surface, leaving a clean trail through the layer of grime. Her brows furrowed. No footprints, no sign that anyone's been in here for years. So why is Lucky acting like... Before she could finish, Lucky darted forward. Ethan barely had time to react before the pup squeezed under the desk, his tiny paws scratching at the wooden floorboards. He let out a short, insistent bark, then began digging. "Lucky, wait!" Ethan reached for him, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Let him do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucky kept digging, his sharp little claws scraping against the floor. Then, with a soft thud, one of the boards gave way. A small, gaping hole appeared beneath the desk. Mike's face paled. "Okay, now I vote we leave." Sarah shot him a glare before kneeling down and carefully pulling the loose board aside. The darkness beneath the floor was impenetrable, but a faint metallic gleam caught her eye. "There's something down there," she murmured. Ethan leaned in, trying to get a better look. His fingers brushed against something cool and smooth. Carefully, he lifted it out. A small metal box. It was old, rusted along the edges, but still intact. The latch was stiff, sealed shut with age. Ethan's heart pounded as he turned it over in his hands. Mike took a nervous step back. "I swear, if that thing is cursed..." Sarah shot him a look before reaching into her pocket and pulling out a penknife. She carefully wedged the blade under the latch and gave it a firm twist. The lock snapped open. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ethan took a deep breath, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of yellowed papers, brittle with time. Some were letters, folded neatly, while others looked like official documents. But what caught Ethan's eye first was a single black and white photograph resting on top. A man, standing in front of a house. Sarah's breath hitched. "That's Walter Grayson." Ethan's hands trembled as he picked up the photograph. The man in the image was old, his features sharp, but kind. His eyes, even in the faded picture, seemed knowing. Familiar, somehow. And in his arms, Ethan's stomach dropped. Walter Grayson was holding a dog that looked exactly like Lucky. Mike let out a strangled noise. "Okay, nope, that's not possible." Sarah grabbed one of the documents beneath the photograph and carefully unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the faded ink, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. "It's a will," she murmured. "Walter Grayson's will." Ethan frowned. "What does it say?" Sarah swallowed hard. "He left everything to his dog." The room fell into stunned silence. Mike blinked. What?" Sarah turned the page, reading more. Walter never had children. He had no family left. According to this, he left everything to his dog, named Lucky. Ethan's throat went dry. "That's not possible." Mike shook his head. "We need to leave. I'm serious. We need to go." But Ethan wasn't listening. His heart was racing, his mind spinning. He looked down at the pup in his arms. "Lucky." The small dog gazed up at him, those silver eyes steady, almost knowing. Sarah reached for another letter, unfolding it carefully. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. "To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, then I am gone. But I need you to know the truth. Lucky was never just a dog. He found me when I needed him most, just as he will find you. He will guide you, protect you. He is more than he appears. Trust him. He always finds his way home." Sarah's voice trembled as she read the last line. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide. This was written years ago, before Lucky was even born. Mike took another step back. "Nope, absolutely not. We're leaving." But Ethan held Lucky tighter, his mind racing. Walter Grayson had owned a dog named Lucky. A dog that looked just like this one. And now, years later, another Lucky had appeared, one that had led them right back here. Sarah closed the metal box, her hands shaking slightly. "Ethan, I don't think this is a coincidence." Ethan took a deep breath, his fingers curling into Lucky's soft fur. "Neither do I." Mike groaned. "Great. So what do we do now?" Ethan looked down at the pup in his arms. Lucky's tail gave a small wag, his silver eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "We figure out why he came back." Ethan stared at the letter in Sarah's hands, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something deeper, something he didn't have words for. Lucky shifted slightly in his arms, but the small dog remained calm, his silver eyes reflecting the dim light in the abandoned house. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Mike rubbed his hands over his face. "All right, let me get this straight. Some guy named Walter Grayson wrote a letter years ago about this dog. A dog who wasn't even born yet? And now we've got Lucky here, who looks exactly like his dog, acting like he remembers all of it." Sarah swallowed hard. "That's what it looks like." Mike shook his head. "No, that's what it sounds like. What it looks like is a crazy coincidence." Ethan wasn't so sure. He held Lucky a little closer, his heartbeat steadying as he looked into the pup's knowing gaze. "Lucky led us here. He knew we needed to find this." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "And the will? It's real, Mike. Walter Grayson left everything to his dog. He must have known something." Mike threw up his hands. "And where is this dog now? Because unless he's been secretly immortal, he's not around to claim anything." Sarah ran her fingers over the faded paper. "Exactly. But what if he came back?" Mike snorted. "What, like reincarnation?" Ethan looked down at Lucky, his fingers brushing through the pup's soft white fur. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out." Mike groaned. "Okay, and how exactly do we do that?" Sarah sighed. "We start with Walter Grayson. We need to find out everything we can about him, about his dog. If there's any record of what happened to the original Lucky, we might get some answers." Ethan nodded. "Let's go back to the clinic. We can research there." Mike crossed his arms but didn't argue. "Fine. But if this turns into some weird ghost story, I'm out." They packed up the documents carefully, leaving the old house behind. The air outside felt lighter, as if the place itself had been waiting for them to uncover its secret. Lucky trotted beside Ethan, his small tail wagging slightly, but his focus never wavered. He had done what he set out to do. Now, it was their turn. Back at the clinic, Sarah spread the papers out across the desk, carefully smoothing the edges of the delicate letters and documents. Ethan sat beside her, Lucky curled in his lap, while Mike paced near the window, still looking skeptical. Sarah pulled out her laptop. Let's start with the basics. Walter Grayson. See if we can find anything about him beyond what we already know. Ethan leaned in as she typed. What are we looking for? Anything unusual, she said. Records of his dog, family history, anything that connects him to Lucky. It didn't take long to find something strange. Sarah clicked on an old newspaper archive and skimmed through the faded text. Here, Walter Grayson's obituary. Died 6 years ago. No surviving family. But look at this. Ethan followed her gaze. Walter Grayson was preceded in death by his beloved dog, Lucky, who passed away 1 month prior. Mike stopped pacing. That's weird. The guy left everything to his dog, but the dog died before he did? So what happened to his estate? Sarah scrolled down. It says the property was left untouched. No next of kin. The town council took control of it, but there's no mention of what happened to Lucky's remains. Ethan frowned. You mean, there's no grave? Sarah shook her head. Not that I can find. Mike muttered under his breath. This just keeps getting creepier. Ethan looked down at Lucky, who had lifted his head, ears twitching. We need to find out where he was buried. Sarah nodded. I'll keep searching. But if there's no official record, we might have to do this the old-fashioned way. Mike raised an eyebrow. Which means? Ethan met his gaze. We go back to the house. Mike groaned. Why do I even ask? That night, they returned to Walter Grayson's property. The air was colder than before, a crisp breeze rustling through the trees. The house loomed ahead, dark and silent, but Lucky didn't hesitate. He trotted forward, leading them past the porch, around the side of the house, toward the backyard. Ethan's pulse quickened. He knows where he's going. Sarah shivered. I believe it. They followed Lucky through the overgrown grass until they reached the far end of the yard, where an old wooden fence bordered the property. Lucky stopped, sniffing the ground, then began scratching at the dirt near a large oak tree. Mike folded his arms. Great. Now he wants us to dig. Sarah shot him a look before kneeling beside Lucky. She ran her hand over the ground, feeling the uneven earth beneath her fingers. This soil's been disturbed before, a long time ago. Ethan's breath caught. This is it, isn't it? This is where he was buried. Sarah nodded slowly. It has to be. They worked carefully, using small shovels in their hands to clear the dirt. It didn't take long before something solid appeared beneath the soil. A small wooden box, worn and weathered from years underground. Ethan's hands trembled as he brushed away the remaining dirt. Is this? Sarah swallowed hard. It must be. Mike took a step back. I don't know if I want to see what's inside. Ethan hesitated, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in faded cloth, were the remains of a collar. The leather was cracked with age, the metal tag rusted, but the name engraved on it was still clear. Lucky. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Ethan's throat tightened as he looked down at the collar, then back at the small pup sitting beside him. It's him. Sarah exhaled shakily. I don't understand how, but it has to be. Mike ran a hand through his hair. Okay, so just say, this is the same dog. What does that even mean? How did he come back? Ethan shook his head. I don't know, but Walter's letter said something, that Lucky always finds his way home. Sarah stared at the small pup who had led them here, her mind spinning. Maybe he meant it literally. Lucky stepped forward, his tiny paw resting on the old collar. His silver eyes glowed softly in the moonlight, filled with something deep, something ancient. Mike let out a breath. So, what do we do now? Ethan looked down at Lucky, then at the grave they had uncovered. The answers weren't clear, but one thing was. Lucky had found his way back. And now, they had to figure out why. Ethan sat cross-legged in the grass, his fingers still resting on the old collar. The weight of it in his hands was almost unreal, as if it shouldn't exist in both the past and present. But there it was. The name Lucky was still clear, etched into the rusted metal tag, the same name carried by the tiny pup sitting quietly at his side. Sarah rubbed her arms, the night air growing colder by the minute. I keep trying to come up with a logical explanation for this, but I can't. Mike sighed and shoved his hands into his pockets. You know what? I'm done fighting it. We have a puppy that led us to his own grave. Let's just roll with it. Ethan barely heard them. His eyes were locked on Lucky, who was still staring at the collar, his silver eyes unreadable. What happens now? Sarah exhaled. That's what we have to figure out. They carefully reburied the collar, making sure to leave the ground as undisturbed as possible. Lucky didn't move as they did, only watching, as if he understood what they were doing. Once they were finished, Ethan stood and picked him up, holding the small dog against his chest. You okay, buddy? He murmured. Lucky blinked up at him, his tiny tail wagging once. It was the only reassurance Ethan needed. As they made their way back to the clinic, silence settled between them, each lost in their own thoughts. What had they uncovered? What did it mean? And most importantly, why had Lucky come back? Back at the clinic, they settled into the back office, spreading the documents across the table. Sarah flipped through the letters again, rereading Walter's words carefully. He wrote this as if he knew, as if he was certain Lucky would return. Ethan nodded. Yeah, but how did he know? Mike grabbed a pen and started making a list. Okay, let's lay it all out. Walter Grayson had a dog named Lucky. He passed away 6 years ago, but before he died, he left everything to his dog. Then Lucky died a month before Walter, and the estate was abandoned. Now we have a new Lucky, born to Daisy, and he led us straight back to his own grave. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Which means Walter knew something. But what? Ethan's fingers tapped against the table. We need to find out more about Walter. Who he was, what he did, anything that could explain this. Mike sighed. Great, more research. My favorite. Sarah ignored him and pulled her laptop closer. Let's start with records. There's got to be something about him that we missed. They worked late into the night, digging through archives, old town records, anything they could find. Walter had lived a quiet life. No family, no children. But the more they searched, the more they realized something strange. There's nothing about his past, Sarah said, scrolling through documents. No birth record, no early history. He just shows up in town records one day, about 30 years ago. Ethan frowned. That doesn't make sense. Mike rubbed his temples. None of this does, man. Sarah leaned forward. What if Walter wasn't originally from here? What if he came from somewhere else? Ethan tilted his head. Then where was he before? They kept searching, and finally Sarah found something. Here. This might be something. She turned the screen toward them. It was an old newspaper clipping from a town nearly 100 miles away. The headline read, "Local man rescued by mysterious dog credits Lucky for saving his life." Ethan's pulse quickened. What does it say? Sarah skimmed through. It's about Walter. When he was younger, he got lost during a bad winter storm. They searched for him for days. Everyone thought he wouldn't make it. But then out of nowhere, he was found near a cabin in the woods, alive. And he kept saying it was all because of his dog, Lucky. Mike blinked. Wait, he had a Lucky back then too? Sarah nodded slowly. It sounds like it. He told everyone that Lucky led him to shelter, kept him warm, and stayed with him until help arrived. But here's the thing. She scrolled down. Nobody else ever saw the dog. When the search team found Walter, he was alone. No tracks, no signs of a dog. Just him. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine. Then who was Lucky? Sarah shook her head. I don't know, but if Walter really was saved by a dog that no one else could see, and then later had another Lucky... Mike finished the thought. Then this dog's been following him his whole life. Ethan swallowed hard. And now, he's here. Lucky let out a small whimper and nuzzled against Ethan's chest. He was warm, real, breathing. But there was no denying that something about him was beyond explanation. Sarah leaned forward. If this really is the same Lucky that saved Walter, then why is he here now? Why was he born again? Mike groaned. I don't know, but I hate that question. Ethan looked down at the pup in his arms. Maybe we're supposed to find out. The room fell into silence as the weight of it all settled on them. Lucky had led them here, step by step. He had shown them what they needed to see. But there was still something missing. Something just out of reach. Sarah exhaled. We need more time to figure this out. For now, we let Lucky be Lucky, and we watch. Ethan nodded. Agreed. They cleaned up the documents, but the questions lingered. Lucky had come back. That much was clear. The mystery now was why. As Ethan locked up the clinic for the night, Lucky curled against his chest, his tiny heartbeat steady against Ethan's own. The pup let out a content sigh, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something had brought Lucky back, and whatever it was, they hadn't uncovered the full story yet. Ethan lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his room. Lucky was curled up at the foot of his bed, his small chest rising and falling in steady, rhythmic breaths. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that stretched on endlessly, leaving nothing but thoughts to fill the space. The discovery of the old collar weighed heavily on his mind. Lucky had led them straight to it, as if he knew exactly where to go. And then there was Walter Grayson's story. The man had been saved by a dog that no one else had seen, only for another Lucky to appear later in his life. And now, years after both had passed, here was Lucky again, just as sharp, just as knowing. Ethan glanced toward the pup, who was sleeping soundly. "Who are you?" he whispered. Lucky's ear twitched, but he didn't wake. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the clinic early. Sarah and Mike were already there, their eyes tired but focused. It was clear none of them had gotten much sleep. "All right," Mike said, rubbing his face. "Tell me we have a plan. Because if I spend one more night thinking about ghost dogs, I might lose it." Sarah was already pulling out her laptop. I did more digging last night. I think we need to go back further. If Walter was found with a mysterious dog as a young man, that means Lucky, whoever or whatever he is, has been around even longer than we thought." Ethan nodded. "You think there are more records?" Sarah clicked through several archives. "It's a long shot, but I looked into older cases of people claiming to be saved by animals, especially cases where the animal in question was never found afterward. I found a few, but one stood out." She turned the screen toward them. It was another newspaper clipping, this one even older than the last. The headline read, "Local child rescued from river. Claims Lucky. Pulled him to shore." Ethan's eyes widened. This was decades before Walter. Sarah nodded. Different town, different year, but the story is eerily similar. A child fell into a river, was missing for hours, and then somehow made it to shore alive. He claimed a dog named Lucky pulled him out, but no dog was ever found. Witnesses said he was too far out for an animal to reach, and yet he survived. Mike leaned back in his chair. "So what? This dog just shows up whenever someone needs saving?" Sarah exhaled. "That's what it sounds like." Ethan looked down at Lucky, who sat patiently beside him, his silver eyes locked onto the screen as if he understood every word. "And now he's here." Sarah hesitated. "Yeah. But why? Who is he meant to save now?" The question sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Lucky always found his way to someone who needed him. But if that was true, then what danger was coming next? Mike cleared his throat. "So, do we just wait?" Ethan ran a hand over his face. "I don't know, but I don't think Lucky's just going to sit around. I think he's waiting for something." Sarah shut her laptop. "Then we stay close to him. See what happens next." Days passed, and nothing unusual happened. Lucky continued to grow, his senses sharper than any puppy Sarah had ever seen. He still noticed things before anyone else, sounds in the distance, movement in the shadows, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, waiting just beyond their reach. Then, one evening, it happened. Ethan was walking Lucky near the clinic, letting the pup explore. The street was quiet, only a few cars passing by. The air was cool, a breeze rustling the leaves. Everything felt normal. Until Lucky stopped. Ethan nearly tripped over him. "Lucky, what is it?" The pup's ears were pinned forward, his body tensed. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. Then, without warning, he bolted. "Lucky!" Ethan shouted, breaking into a run. The small dog was fast, his little legs carrying him down the sidewalk with urgency. Ethan sprinted after him, his heart pounding. Lucky never ran off without a reason. Lucky turned a corner, and as Ethan followed, he saw it. A car was speeding down the street. Too fast. And just ahead, a little girl was stepping off the curb, completely unaware. Ethan's chest tightened. "Hey, look out!" But it was Lucky who moved first. The small pup lunged forward, right toward the child. He slammed into her legs just as the car screeched past, barely missing them both. The little girl tumbled onto the sidewalk, gasping in surprise, her wide eyes filling with tears. Ethan rushed over, kneeling beside her. "Are you okay?" She nodded shakily, looking down at Lucky, who was now standing beside her, his tiny body still tense. He let out a soft whimper, pressing his nose against her hand. The girl's mother came running from a nearby shop, panic in her eyes. "Emily! Oh my God, are you hurt?" Emily shook her head, pointing at Lucky. "He saved me." Ethan looked at the pup, his heart hammering. "Yeah, he did." The mother scooped her daughter into her arms, looking from Ethan to Lucky. "That dog, he just..." Ethan swallowed hard. He knew. Sarah and Mike arrived moments later, having heard the commotion. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw Lucky standing protectively beside the girl. What happened? Ethan took a deep breath. He saved her. Mike let out a low whistle. You've got to be kidding me. But Ethan wasn't kidding. Lucky had sensed it, just like before, just like every time. And suddenly, everything they had discovered made sense. Walter had been saved by Lucky. The child in the river had been saved by Lucky. And now, Lucky had saved Emily. Sarah knelt beside the pup, running a gentle hand over his head. So this is why you came back. Lucky looked up at her, his silver eyes full of something deep, something endless. He had been here before. He would be here again. He was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a protector. Ethan scooped him up, holding him close. You really are special, huh? Lucky licked his cheek, his tail wagging. Sarah exhaled. I think we finally understand him. Mike shook his head, but for once, he wasn't arguing. Yeah, and now I kinda want to see what he does next. Ethan smiled, looking down at the small dog in his arms. Me too. Lucky had found his way back. And this time, Ethan knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days following Lucky's heroic act were filled with quiet reflection. Emily's mother had come back to thank them, bringing a basket of baked goods and a small stuffed toy for Lucky. She'd called him a miracle, a little guardian angel sent to protect her daughter. Ethan, Sarah, and Mike didn't argue. They had seen it with their own eyes. Lucky had saved Emily, just as he had saved Walter, just as he had saved the child in the river decades ago. The pattern was undeniable. He was more than a dog. He was something else, something eternal. But what did it mean for him now? Ethan sat outside the clinic, Lucky curled in his lap. The sky was a pale blue, wispy clouds floating lazily overhead. Daisy rested nearby, watching her pup with quiet understanding. She had known, hadn't she? From the moment he was born, Daisy had sensed something about Lucky that was different, special. Sarah stepped out, hands in her coat pockets. I've been thinking. Ethan glanced up. About what? She sat beside him. About everything. About why Lucky keeps coming back. Why he always finds the people who need him. Mike joined them, letting out a heavy sigh as he plopped into the chair across from them. Let me guess. You think he's some kind of divine being now? Sarah shook her head. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I don't think it's random. I think he's here for a reason, and once that reason is fulfilled, he moves on. Ethan's stomach twisted. Moves on? Sarah met his gaze, her expression gentle. Walter passed away after Lucky died. It was almost as if Lucky had done what he was meant to do, and when his time was up, he left. And then he was reborn. Found someone new. And now he's here, with us. Ethan tightened his hold on the pup, the thought of losing him settling like a weight on his chest. So what happens now? Mike hesitated before answering. We don't know, but if Sarah's theory is right, Lucky might not stay forever. Ethan looked down at the small white dog in his lap, his heart clenching. But I don't want to lose him. Sarah reached out, giving Ethan's arm a reassuring squeeze. I don't think you will. Not really. He always comes back. The words offered little comfort. Ethan had never felt connected to an animal like this before, Lucky wasn't just a pet. He was family. How could he just let go, knowing that someday he might wake up and Lucky would be gone? Lucky lifted his head, licking Ethan's fingers before giving a small sigh, as if he understood. As if he was telling him that everything was going to be okay. The next few months passed in quiet peace. Lucky continued to grow, his presence becoming a staple at the clinic. People in town started calling him the miracle dog, whispering about how he had saved Emily, how he always seemed to be watching over people. But to Ethan, he was still just Lucky, the dog who had found him. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan woke up to an unfamiliar silence. Usually Lucky would be curled up by his feet, his tiny breaths soft and steady. But this time, the bed was empty. A sinking feeling settled in Ethan's chest as he sat up. Lucky? No answer. He jumped out of bed, searching the house, the yard, the clinic, anywhere Lucky might have gone. Sarah and Mike joined the search, their worry mirroring his own, but Lucky was nowhere to be found. Ethan's throat tightened. No, he wouldn't just leave. Sarah's voice was quiet. Maybe he had to. Ethan shook his head. No, not yet, not yet. But deep down, he knew. Lucky had done what he was meant to do. He had saved who he needed to save. And now he was gone. The loss was sharp, cutting into Ethan's chest like a knife. He sat on the porch that evening, staring out at the horizon, waiting for a sign. But none came. Daisy lay beside him, resting her head on his lap. He ran his fingers through her fur, blinking away the burning in his eyes. He always finds his way back, right? Daisy let out a soft huff, her warm brown eyes holding the answer he already knew. Yes. One day, somewhere, Lucky would return.